I've been quite surprised that their offensive thus far has been conducted in the way that it has. It's yet another example of how the Russians are not fighting well.
Yeah.
And the Ukrainians should not allow themselves to be drawn into the equivalent of that. They have got to gain maneuver. They've got to move from defensive operations into high intensity maneuver warfare under a combined arms approach, which will then bring, hopefully, and I think probably bring very positive results.
Okay.
I mean, part of the issue, of course, is we tend to latch on to anything that's negative about what Russia is doing and under the positive for what the Ukrainians are doing, and that's perfectly understandable. But a lot of the comments about what's going on in Russia, I just think we need to be careful and not take necessarily with a pinch of salt, but be careful that we don't read too much into it. I mean, there has been lots of press coverage about the Wagner Group and their complaints about lack of ammunition and,
Yes.
and the tensions between them and Moscow. If this is true, that and there's been talk of this before, of course. I can remember discussions about this actually about a year ago when they were surrounding Kiev and so forth. What we call and I've said this before on your program, what we call in the British military the moral component of fighting power, the will to win, the preparedness to die on the battlefield, is very powerful in the Ukraine military thus far, and I think it will continue to be that way. That's obviously not the case in the Russian military. And I think many of the soldiers involved will be tired and fed up with what's going on. And a lot of the senior military commanders may be losing any confidence they have in their senior military commanders or indeed in the overall intent of what Putin is trying to achieve.
Yes.
So I wouldn't be surprised if people are, mutiny is a strong word, of course, but nonetheless, I wouldn't be surprised if people were kicking back against it.
Yes, I mean, I think you're no doubt absolutely right to say let's stay objective and take an objective view of the information that reaches us here about what's going on the ground in the Ukraine war. But some of this stuff is borne out by what we see in public, isn't it? The Evgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner private army, he has been pretty open about criticizing the Russian Defense Ministry about the supply of ammunition that his forces, his private army, has been getting, or rather not getting, which I suppose is encouraging to the Ukrainians.
Yes, yeah, it is. To be honest, I'm not quite sure how this whole relationship with the Wagner Group work. They're obviously under contract. Essentially they're a private military company doing the fighting on behalf of Moscow. Now, whether they are responsible for finding their own ammunition, which you would expect in some respects for a private company, or whether the contract in inverted commas includes that Russia would provide it all, I don't know. But it's quite clear that on both sides, actually, ammunition is being used up at an extraordinary rate, and the reality is, I think it was the King of Prussia who said in about 1780, "Without supplies, no army is brave," and that applies in spades, of course, to ammunition. And they've been burning through huge quantities of ammunition day by day over the last few months.
Yes.
Now they're looking, as we are in the West, actually, to have to rebuild those stocks and to find places to buy them from, be that China, North Korea, or elsewhere. But I suspect those rumors are true. I suspect the Wagner Group are short of ammunition. I mean, when you go into the places like Bakhmut, you are fighting in what we call the fighting in built-up areas, fibula, and it just sucks in people and stuff. Fighting your way house by house, street by street in a city is really tough work. It's hard. It's it just uses up ammunition in particular, and it uses up people on both sides, actually, Russian and Ukrainian.
And again, I mean, bearing in mind your caution about I don't know, a pinch of salt with the information that reaches us, I'm now also seeing these reports, I'm sure you are, about the Russians calling on old tanks, Soviet-era tanks, and sending them to the front line, whereas more advanced battle tanks, Russian battle tanks, straight off the production line, well, some of those have been shown to be unreliable. One or two have broken down on parade.
Yeah, I mean, they were moved to euphemistically a war footing, I think, some time ago. We haven't done that yet in the West, really, although there's signs of that happening. I think some of these pictures we're seeing we have to relate them to what they're using them for. And in particular, the drone warfare, the battle of the drones, if you like, is forcing people to think up fresh ideas of how to take these drones out. And some of these systems where we're seeing armored vehicles as well as soft-skinned vehicles are, I think, directed particularly against the drones.
Yes.
Now, the Russians have obviously lost a lot of heavy armored vehicles, and they need to replace them. So whilst they have, I think, ramped up their production lines, probably what we're seeing is that they're pushing stuff off the production line too quickly, and some of those vehicles are proving to be unreliable. And clearly there's a danger in that. That's why replacing these armored vehicles takes time, both for us and for the Russians. And you have to manufacture these things properly.
Now, so while the fighting goes on fiercely around a place like Bakhmut, which is thought not to be strategically very important, but it has become enormously important symbolically, no ground has been gained of any significance by the Russians. And we're now wondering, aren't we, when will the Ukrainian counter offensive begin? So for the sake of people like me, military absolute layman, I'm sure many people listening to this, when it comes to that Ukrainian counter push, what might that look like?
Yeah, well, two or three things. First of all, your point is well made. Why are they fighting so so strongly over this? I mean, it's widely recognized that it's not strategically important. Why didn't the Russians just bypass it, cut it off? And why are the Ukrainians fighting so hard over it? Now, there's obviously the psychology of that, and there's the morale issues and so on and so forth. But partly, I think the Russians are now reaching, and they've done it a couple of times before, what we call the culminating point. You put in an offensive, you fight hard, and then suddenly you can't go any further. Your logistics begins to dry up. Your people are tired. You can't replace the battle casualties and so on. And you have to take a strategic pause while you try and regain all that stuff. Now, the Ukrainians haven't got to that point because they haven't been conducting an offensive. What would it look like? Well, I can't see that they're going to put an offensive to try and retake a city. Well, they might, but I wouldn't advise trying to retake the city again because it just sucks in people. But what they need to do is to find places as the weather gets warmer, probably in April, where they can use the weapons that they've been getting from the West, particularly the main battle tanks and the armored vehicles, to conduct combined arms operations, artillery, infantry, heavy armor, supported by logistics and engineering support, as well as things like communication, to enable them to push through relatively undefended areas. Now, where they are and what they look like, I don't honestly know. But their commanders will be looking at how they can bypass any high concentrations of Russian positions and push through and regain as much territory as they can. Now, the Russians aren't going to wait for that to happen. And if I'm honest, I've been quite surprised that their offensive thus far has been conducted in the way that it has. It's yet another example of how the Russians are not fighting well.
Yeah.
And the Ukrainians should not allow themselves to be drawn into the equivalent of that. They have got to gain maneuver. They've got to move from defensive operations into high intensity maneuver warfare under a combined arms approach, which will then bring, hopefully, and I think probably bring very positive results.
Well, I'm John Pienaar, and if you found that interesting, we are here each day, Monday to Thursday, 5 o'clock till 7 o'clock on Drive, and from 7 till 8, Pienaar and Friends, where we discuss the big stories of the day each day on Times Radio.